are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we're now ready to begin our webinar, Engagement, a Contrarian Perspective. My name is Virginia Boccaccio with Rutgers Executive and Professional Education. Rutgers EPE is the proud sponsor for this webinar, which highlights timely topic areas and issues in human resource management, leadership development, and management development. We've formally allotted 30 minutes for today's webinar. You can send your questions throughout the presentation using the questions box. The orange arrow depicted here opens and closes your controls. With your controls open, you will see the questions box on the lower half and the send button on the lower right. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the archived version will be sent to you via email. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our instructor. Bill Castellano, Rutgers Professor and Associate Dean of Executive and Professional Education, has over 30 years of experience working in corporate Fortune 50, entrepreneurial, and research environments. Additionally, Bill's research, teaching, and consulting activities are focused on the effective management of human capital, employee engagement, and developing leaders for the challenges of the 21st century. Bill, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Virginia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually meet you all. In the time that we have today, what I would like to do is to give you an overview of some of the current thinking and challenges that companies are facing regarding employee engagement and offer you an alternative view, which we're calling a contrarian view on this particular topic. A lot of the research that I did for this seminar and other projects that I've worked on have been published in this book, Practices for Engaging the 21st Century Workforce. So for those who are interested in taking a deeper dive into this topic, I would suggest looking over this book. Engagement, as we all know, has been a very hot topic for quite some time. Not surprisingly, when you think about, we're a knowledge-based economy and how companies manage their human and intellectual capital is critically important, for them to be able to have sustainable competitive advantage. Unfortunately, when you look at a lot of the studies regarding engagement, the vast majority of them show that employees are not engaged, and yet over 90% of leaders think that having an engagement strategy, an effective engagement strategy, can have a positive impact on their business, but yet only 25% feel that they have a workable strategy. And that's a real challenge, considering that we know that there's been a lot of other published reports showing that engaged employees are much more productive and generate more revenue and profits for organizations. So the real question, I think, to begin with is what are we talking about when we're talking about engagement? And a lot of the traditional research going back into the 90s originally took a macro view where we looked at various HR systems and how they related to strategic outcomes. And that's when we came up with various kinds of models, the high performance system, the high commitment, high involvement system. And then the next question was, well, how is this happening? And that's when we took it down to a micro level, right? Some researchers called it the black box. And there we're looking at employees' perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors as generating strategic outcomes. And this was kind of the genesis of this interest in engagement. The problem, over these last couple of decades has been, for every consultant and every researcher, there seems to be a different measure or even a different model on engagement. Some measures look at it as a psychological state. Some think about it as behaviors, others as traits. The very common Gallup Q12 model, which is used by a lot of organizations, really is not a measure of engagement. It's more of a measure of some of the actionable aspects of engagement. So there's a lot of confusion, particularly separating the measures from the drivers from the outcomes of engagement. The other problem that we see, many of these measures, don't have constructs that are highly correlated with performance. It's usually a surprise to a lot of people that job satisfaction in and of itself is not a very good measure. We know there's a lot of satisfied employees who are not very productive, some of whom may actually be lazy. And we know that answering the question, are you planning to stay with this company, which is a measure of continuous commitment, is also not highly related to performance. Many of your employees who may answer that question negatively may be some of your most highest performing employees. So in our research, we think of engagement as really being a multi-dimensional construct that consists of measures involving job involvement. Are you absorbed in the work that you're doing, rather than continuous commitment, effective commitment, which is more of a measure of your identification with an organization, is a much better way of thinking about engagement. Rather than satisfaction, positive affectivity really represents somebody's vigor and energy when they come into the workplace. And then there is a behavioral component. Employees that are involved in discretionary effort, extra role behavior, volunteering for work, helping their co-workers, again, reflects a lot of the thinking in which managers think of when we have an engaged employee. The problem is we're dealing with a highly diverse, multi-generational workforce who come to the workplace with very different values, preferences, and needs. So there are a multitude of drivers of engagement. And I think this is the key challenge. Organizations are falling over themselves, trying to be everything to everybody. And as a result, we have a lot of disappointed employees. We have a lot of employees who are not engaged. So there's something going on in this space. In our view, which some call the Contrarian review, is we really should be thinking about this in a more strategic framework. And that's what we're calling it strategic engagement. And what we found in our research, it's really about two primary drivers. It's all about fit and line of sight. So what do we mean by that? Fit really talks about it's critically important for organizations to be able to attract and select people who fit their organizational culture. Not only have the competencies and the skills and the experience for the job, but again, fit the culture of that organization. Line of sight highlights, do employees understand how their role, the work that they're doing, their behaviors, how is that impacting strategic outcomes? So organizations that can convey that to employees, where employees clearly know their performance measures, their performance metrics, what they need to do to be successful in this organization, we find that these two elements in and of itself really creates what we call a high-performing culture that is most correlated with the strategic outcomes that organizations are searching for when they're interested in this topic called employee engagement. So what do we mean by strategic engagement? It's really shaping employees' mindsets and behaviors, having them understand what they're doing and how it impacts the creation of customer and economic value for the organization. So it's really kind of turning the model around. First and foremost, it's understanding what your culture is and understanding how important that culture is to succeeding the strategic outcomes of your organization. Here's a quote from Gerstner, when he took over IBM and they were transitioning from a mainframe manufacturers of computers to a very different strategy, focusing on solutions, focusing on consulting, realized that the most critical component of the future success of IBM was aligning the people with this new culture. And that's a lesson for all of us, thinking about what companies need to have a highly engaged, highly productive workforce that are achieving the goals of an organization. So what do you want your workforce to know? When we're talking about fit, you want to make sure you're selecting people and that you're communicating to your employees about who you are, right? Your brand of the company values that the company is promoting, and their workforce philosophy, right? And then picking people, selecting people, refining the culture as organizations go forward. Another characteristic of a high-performing culture is what we call a highly differentiated culture. Understanding that not every employee impacts strategic outcomes equally, so you need to have a very strategic focus on your workforce. When we think about moving from a less differentiated to a highly differentiated, we're talking about going from equality to equity, engagement to a strategic focus, not being an employer of choice, but focusing on employee of choice. Are you picking the right people who have the skills, who fit into your organization? Going from an entitlement culture to a culture based on earned increases, not employment for life, but offering people employability. So there are many things that organizations can do to create what we call a high-performing culture, and then picking people who are going to fit into that culture is going to have the greatest impact on engagement and strategic outcomes. So when we think about this high-performance culture, what do you want your workforce to know about your company? That's a very different orientation. Rather than asking employees about how they feel about this or feel about that, you want them to know, well, what is it that they need to do to be successful in this organization? When it comes to strategic talent, who are the individuals that are creating the economic value for your company and ensuring that they're acting and behaving in a way that's going to be most productive to the organization? And then clearly, how do you want your leaders to behave? How should they be acting to sustain a high-performance culture? And none of this could really take place without having an effective and an efficient HR function that can create this high-performing culture. So when we think about surveys and we think about how do we measure engagement, what we're really saying in this context is, what do you want to know about your workforce? How can we help our workforce turn customer and investor expectations into employee behaviors? It's a completely different orientation than most organizations have when they think about employee engagement, particularly when it comes to their approaches to surveys. Most surveys that I have seen are what we call passive sentiment surveys. They're asking questions about, how do you feel about this program, or how do you feel about this particular interaction, as opposed to a more active sentiment where you're putting the burden necessarily on the employee about, are they acting, are they behaving in ways that are adding economic value? Critically important in this context is to use surveys to provide information that individuals need to know about your company and about what it does mean to be successful in this organization. In essence, you're communicating expectations to your employees. Here's what you need to do to be successful in this organization. It's a very, very different orientation. The questions that we would come up with are very different than the questions that you would typically see on most engagement surveys. As an example, some of these active workforce metrics, as you can see, you're asking questions of the employees about, I seek to know the business and how our company creates value. Right? I develop and share ideas. I know where I should take my ideas. I work to become a missionary for the company. I ask customers how I can help them. I believe my work has real meaning. Right? These are very different active type questions that are conveying to the employee, these are the kinds of behaviors that we would expect of employees who are going to be engaged in helping us achieve the goals that we need to achieve. And then equally important is to use these surveys to communicate information about your company, about your strategy, so that individual employees understand how they fit into this company, what they need to know to be successful in this organization. And it's really communicating expectations. Part of the problem with most traditional engagement surveys is it elevates expectations of employees by asking all of these questions about a variety of different policies and programs and activities that companies think may be engaging employees. And if they don't initiate or implement some of those ideas and strategies, employees become disappointed. They feel that there was somewhat of a breach of implied contract. We suggest that the survey should specifically communicate the expectations of the company. Here's what we feel you should know about our business, about how we create value, what we expect the interactions of employees to be when dealing with customers. Very different orientation. And then equally important is the leader role. If you're talking about fit, if you're talking about creating a high-performing culture, then it's critically important for leaders to be able to communicate to employees on a continuing basis about the business strategy, how are we planning to grow this business, be able to communicate what are the obstacles and how do we plan to overcome these future obstacles, enforce the capabilities and the culture that we need to create to be successful. If we're dealing with change, how are we dealing and managing that change? Equally important, what are the metrics of success at this particular organization? Are we focusing on creativity? Are we focusing on efficiency? And then most important, what's in it for you, for the employee? If you do behave in these ways, if you do fit into this organizational culture, here's what we're going to do for you. And again, it's reversing the common model of engagement. In most models, the focus is, well, here's what we need to do to engage employees, and if we have engaged employees, we're going to achieve these strategic outcomes. In this contrarian view, we're reversing that model. We're saying if you pick high-performing people and create a high-performing culture, those are going to be your most engaged, and those are the employees that are going to be most impacting the strategic outcomes of your organization. It also emphasizes the point that you really can't be everything to every person. I tell companies all the time, be who you are. Right? I mean, there are companies who focus on innovation, who may be hiring creative people, and they can create very flexible work schedules. They can have an informal environment, maybe where people could take breaks and have massages and all these very interesting things, because that is the culture that they need to develop for that particular strategy. But that's in contrast to a company who may be very aggressive, have a very competitive culture, maybe a very formal culture because of the industry or the clients that they're dealing with, and they need to be true to who they are. And trying to be everything to everybody, we know is going to be the biggest factor of them not achieving their strategic outcomes. And then reinforcing what we're talking about here, ensuring that you're picking the right people that's going to fit into this culture, and then creating this high-performing culture will be most positively related to these measures of engagement that we've been talking about, and more importantly, achieving the strategic outcomes of your organization. So we've asked you in the beginning to submit some questions. I'm going to give you maybe another minute or two, and we'll be more than happy to respond to any questions you have on this topic. But in the meantime, Virginia has some important information to share with you.
Thank you, Bill. So we wanted to let everybody know that this webinar has been approved for 1 business recertification credit through HRCI and 0.5 professional development credit through SHRM. So if you're interested in obtaining this credit, please contact me. My email is below. And we wanted to thank everybody for participating in our webinar. We'd like to extend to you a 20% discount on our programs, our upcoming programs in the fall. As you can see, we have an array of programs in human resource management, leadership development, management development, and project management. So to reserve your spot, please go to our website, epe.rutgers.edu, and you can use the discount code webinar 051316. And for more information on today's topic, Bill will be instructing practices for engaging the 21st century workforce. This is a 3-hour module within our Master's Certificate Next Gen HR program. Bill will be instructing on September 27th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and then on December 5th from 9 to noon. And then also our Next Gen program has been approved for 30 business recertification credit hours through HRCI and 30 professional development credits through SHRM. And again, to register, you can go to our website, epe.rutgers.edu. Our next webinar that we'd like you to save the date for is Leading Teams Through Change. This will be on June 22nd at noon, and you'll be receiving emails shortly about this webinar as well. So we're now going to take some of your questions. And Bill, our first question is, what do companies need to do to engage millennials?
That's an interesting question. And that was really a question that made me stop believing in this contrarian view. It highlights the struggles that I think some companies have trying to be everything to everybody. And even in the research that I've done on millennials, most of the things that we hear about millennials or any of the generational cohorts are generalizations. Meaning, if you look at a 20-something-year-old who is a graduate from a very good university, who's single, that person's going to come to the workplace with very different preferences and needs than a 20-something-year-old who didn't go to college, who may be a single parent with a child. So these generalizations are just that. And again, rather than trying to be everything to everybody, I would continue to consult companies to focus on their culture, focus on a high-performing culture, and make sure that you're selecting and recruiting the people who you feel are going to be successful in that culture.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question, Bill, is how are some of the ways you can tell if surveys are effective?
Well, again, looking at, are they asking passive questions or active questions? Are they setting the right expectations that you want employees to know about what it takes to be successful in this organization? So asking questions about, do employees understand the strategy? Asking questions about, are employees behaving in ways that are adding customer value or economic value is a much better approach than asking a series of questions about what people may like or how they feel about a particular topic.
Okay, great. Thank you. It looks like that was our last question. If anybody has any additional questions that you think of after the webinar, please feel free to email me. I can certainly funnel that to Bill and get those answered for you. So this concludes today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, a link to the archive recording of the presentation will be sent to you probably by early next week. And we hope to see you in a future workshop. Again, for more information, please visit our website, epe.rutgers.edu. Thank you.
Thank you.